Today we're talking about everybody's favorite national holiday, 9/11. So I'm going to go into kind of the pillars of what people base their beliefs on when it comes to these conspiracies around 9/11, and those are going to be kind of like, the towers were designed to withstand plane crashes, or jet fuel doesn't melt steel beams, or buildings don't fall like that. And those are kind of like the major ones, and then there's a couple more. And then I will touch a little bit on the more, out there kind of stuff at the end a little bit. So the first point being that what I thought was interesting, because I didn't know this, was that the buildings were designed to withstand a plane crash. And yes, this is true. They were designed. I mean, they're in New York. They're designed. I mean, planes are flying everywhere. They should probably be designed in case of a crazy emergency to withstand, a horrible event. During the investigation of the attack, the NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology, received a 3-page document discussing that the towers were designed to be able to withstand a crash of a Boeing 707. And a lot of people, when they hear that, they're like, boom, see right there, like the planes couldn't have taken it down, and the planes that hit the building were Boeings, and that's the end of the story. However, when you dig just below the surface, you find out there is quite a difference in weight between the plane that hit the towers and the planes that it was built to withstand. The Boeing 707, the weight is anywhere from 122,500 pounds to 257,340 pounds, obviously give or take. The planes that hit the towers were Boeing 767 passenger planes that weighed between 315,000 pounds to 450,000 pounds. So there is a substantial amount of weight difference between the two planes the two planes we're talking about. There is almost 200,000 pounds. Another thing that I remember learning during the research for this is that the buildings were designed to take a plane that was descending and slowing down, where these planes were speeding up as they hit the towers. So the force of almost 500,000 pounds hitting the towers is going to cause way more damage than the buildings are designed to withstand. Another big pillar, I guess you could say, is that there are eyewitness accounts of debris being found in the lobby of the towers, and that there are no elevator shafts that run the entire length of the building. And the claim is that, how is that possible if the plane hit the tower and the debris fell from that into the lobby, but there's no way that could have possibly happened? And correct, yes, there were no elevators that went the entire length of the building. So what that means is that you would have to take one elevator to the 15th floor, and then take one off the 15th floor to the 70th floor, or whatever. That's just an example. However, the shafts of the elevators did run the entire length. So there were these massive holes where the elevators usually were running the whole length. So if the building was hit at the top, there would be area for the fireballs and the debris to fall down into the lobby. And you might be thinking, well, what about the elevators? They probably wouldn't allow the debris to fall into the lobby because of the ceiling, right? And it's of the elevator. And it's yeah, sure. However, when the planes did hit the building, all of the elevators fell into free fall, crashing into the bottom floors. And 2 points on that. First, that would be obviously that would cause an insane amount of debris if thousands of pounds of metal are free falling and crashing into the earth. That's going to shoot debris everywhere. And then also, that must have been an insane zero gravity experience for a second. And I know that sounds horrible, but there had to have been a few moments where it was wow, this is really dope. And then they'd probably all be dead if you were stuck in the elevator. I'm just saying. I don't know if I can keep that in. Next big claim is that jet fuel does not burn steel beams. Beans? Well, I mean, it wouldn't if there were steel beams. The jet fuel would not burn them either, because jet fuel doesn't burn steel in general. And here's the math. So jet fuel burns at about 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, and steel melts at around 25 degrees Fahrenheit. However, the beams would not have to melt in order for the buildings to collapse. The NIST estimated that between all of the burning debris, the plastics, the wood, the paper, all that kind of stuff, that there were pockets in the building that reached up to 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit. So even then, the fires themselves from all the burning stuff couldn't have melted the steel beams that supported the building. However, hold on. At 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, steel loses about 50% of its strength. And at 1832 degrees, steel will have lost about 90% of its strength. A good way to think about it is when you heat up like a piece of metal and you can bend it. Like, I can't take a metal bar and bend it between my hands. But if I were to take a blowtorch or something and heat up the middle of that bar until it's red hot, I could then, after a certain amount of time, bend the bar, and then it could break. It would fold under that pressure is what I'm getting at. So the building's beams that were in the walls, were built in an H shape. So imagine an H, and then each line going up and down on that H is a steel beam, and then to support those steel beams, there was one directly in the center. And so if at 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit, that steel beam loses 90% of its strength, and a plane had hit the building, the weight of the building alone plus the plane would have been enough to crumble that middle piece and fold the H in on itself, causing the building to collapse. So yes, the jet fuel does not melt steel beams at all. However, it could burn hot enough to cause it to lose its integrity, to have it cave in on itself. So another big claim that I wanted to talk about was how people say that it looks like a controlled demolition because if a plane hit the building, it wouldn't have fallen like that, because everyone is an expert on everything nowadays. Because, you know, yeah, we have a lot of planes hitting buildings that big all the time that we can just reference. It does look like a controlled demolition. I've seen countless angles on Instagram that will show you that, yes, it looks like it was controlled and that it wasn't a naturally falling building. However, this is not that significant or surprising when you look at how controlled demolitions work. So a good way to think about this is how controlled demolition works is similar to that, in a sense of like they blow up the bottom layers of a building, and then the remaining top of it will collapse onto that, and because of the force of all that weight falling, the inertia will then bring down the rest of the building in a relatively controlled manner, instead of, you know, debris and explosion everywhere. So it's kind of like the 40 pounds. If you were to blow it up from the bottom, or if you were to have something, it would fall and collapse in an orderly way. If you were to drop 40 pounds into my arms, it'd be heavier than if I were just to pick up the 40 pounds. Does that make sense? That's the best way I can describe it. And so with the planes, you could see that as the controlled demolition part, I guess you could say. Like, the planes hit, and then all of the buildings, or all of the building above the plane, collapsing under its own weight, hitting where the plane crashed, and then crumbling it down that way, simply from the inertia of its own weight. So I have numbers, so just bear with me. The North Tower was hit between the 93rd and the 99th floor. And the South Tower was hit between the 75th and the 85th floor. So between the height of the plane, the weakening of the beams, and the explosion of the plane and all of the weight of the plane and the fire, I feel like it's not that hard to make the connection and see how the two look similar. I don't know how else to say it. In my mind, that looks pretty logical. There were, I believe, 110 floors in the trade centers. So if they were, especially in the North Tower, any higher, I don't think it would have worked the way that it did. But I can see how it would look like a controlled demolition, because it was kind of, I don't want to say set up, because then that kind of defeats the purpose of what I'm saying, but set up to look like one inadvertently. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is kind of like more fringy stuff, I guess you could say. So thermite in the dust is a big thing that keeps coming up, and it's just wrong from what I could see. And it doesn't come from a very credible source, and the so the story is that the scientist was on ground zero and found all this debris, obviously because there was a terrorist attack, and found all these like micro things of red metal and claimed it to be thermite. However, the samples that he took that he claimed that he found the thermite, he didn't let anybody else look at them for years, and they just sat in his shed. And then the article that was written about it and published was published by a publication that publishes people who will be anything. And I'm not gonna name drop because I don't want to like poop on anyone, but just trust me, bro, is basically the basis of that. And I mean, future studies have showed that it's not thermite, and that it's oxidized iron from rust. So I'm not going to talk about it because it seems kind of dumb, and also that means like the CIA or whoever the powers that be would have had to go into the Twin Towers, lace the walls with thermite, a bunch of thermite, and then detonate them, or have the drones or planes or whatever you want to call them hit the buildings and blow up all the thermite. And I don't know, that just seems really convoluted. So another thing that I wanted to talk about was the Pentagon. And this drew my attention because there are people who believe that it was hit by a missile instead of a plane, because of the size was too small to be the size of a plane impact. However, there are, eyewitness accounts of the plane. However, this is the only footage that they have of the plane, is this one frame from some, I don't know, what, some security camera. And I think it looks kind of like shit, and I'm just, there you go. Now you've seen it. However, the walls of the Pentagon are pretty reinforced, and they're meant to withstand impacts from planes and or missiles or attacks of any kind. Like, it's kind of an important ass building. Like, it's designed to withstand attacks. So, and also the plane hit just outside of the building, so it kind of like hit the ground and fell into it. So the initial crash was into the ground and then the building. So I don't know what math you got to do to figure that out, but it's not worth it to me to try to figure it out right now, because I don't care. Another claim is that there's no debris. Looks like a lot of fucking debris to me. I'm gonna be real. Whether or not it is a plane or a missile or a UFO or Sassy the Sasquatch, I feel like that's the dumbest claim I've ever heard. I want to do like a whole episode on this next part, but I just wanted to reference it here because of how important it is to, I think, all conspiracy theories. There's a study by the physicist David Robert Grimes, and his study would estimate the time it would take for a conspiracy theory to be exposed based on the number of people involved. And I thought that was low-key super interesting. His calculations used data from the PRISM survey program, or surveillance program, my bad, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and the FBI forensic scandals. And Grimes estimated that, this is just quote from the Wikipedia page, everybody. The moon landing would require the involvement of 411,000 people and would be exposed within 3.68 years. And climate change, if that was a joke, would require a minimum of 29,083 people, published climate scientists alone, and would be exposed within 26.77 years, or up to 405,000 people, and in which case it would take within 3.7 years to be exposed as false. And his studies did not consider exposure by outside sources of the alleged conspiracy, just people that would be directly in on it, like scientists or workers or the actors and the astronauts and whatever. And his calculations basically calculate what are the probability of somebody saying something or leaking some kind of information solely based on just human error, or like a mistake, or just, deathbed confession or whatever. He did not take into account the people who, look too into it, or journalists or anything like that. And again, you could go down the rabbit hole of like, well, everything is a lie and the government's lying to us and it's all for, the lizard people to control us and Project Bluebeam and just all that. But like, we're not doing that. Okay. We're just going to look at the presented facts and then discuss it, because I don't have the mental capacity to try to walk myself, let alone a YouTube channel, through that maze at all. At least not at the moment. And so I bring this up because the moon landing is in the climate change. I mean, the climate change thing alone has got to be that's got to be such a big amount of people in on it to make it seem fake. And I think there would have to be that, if not more, people in on the 9/11 hoaxes and stuff to pull it off and then have nobody talk about it. It just seems like that would be such an astronomical amount of people that, it's been 24 years. I feel like somebody would have said something. And like, sure, you can claim that people have. I get that. However, I guess that's where you kind of come into that whole problem of like what a conspiracy theory is versus the truth. But we're going to kind of get into some weird murky waters here in a minute, so bear with me here. Let's talk about the boy Osama bin Laden in the CIA. So, this is another big claim, is that Osama bin Laden worked for the CIA. And like, technically, yes, but also not really. Bear with me. So the history of the Middle East is an insanely kind of it's really sad and violent, and just it's a pretty bloody history. It's really sad. And a lot of that has to do with people kind of using it as like a proxy war type thing, but we're not going to talk about that. Well, we kind of are, but you guys can look into that if you want your own a whole episode on the history of the Middle East. I'll do it, but it's a lot and it's really depressing. So a lot of the history has to do with superpowers using it to fight somebody else or fight for control over it, or like I don't know, maybe the United States and Russia fighting in it all the time will destabilize any country. But the Middle East has been kind of like getting the butt end of the deal every time. The Middle East was kind of used as a power vacuum, and the CIA trained people in terrorism And those people are the people who trained Osama bin Laden. Sorry, it's been a second since I've read through all of this, so bear with me. This is in Operation Cyclone and a bunch of other operations that the government was involved in with the Middle East. The U.S.'s history in the Middle East is really dark and will kind of shed a light on a lot of the reasons why the relationship between the two are the way that they are. But again, a whole other episode. So the U.S. tries to, overthrow certain government people or use the terrorists that they have trained in the Middle East against the Russians. And then those people trained the Osama bin Laden and future terrorists. And it is quoted as being called the University of Jihad, because that's what it kind of was. It was like the CIA established a bunch of different camps and institutions and stuff, institutions to kind of try to kind of train people into being terrorists for their own agenda. The US spread the idea of a holy war against the Russians because they painted the Russians to be godless invaders. And if we haven't learned anything from history class, is that the Middle East loves religion. Who doesn't? And there's that famous quote, like, there's no one more dangerous than a man who believes he's on a holy mission. And if you've convinced a bunch of people that they're on a holy mission against godless invaders, and you're teaching them how to get rid of them, like, that's going to be kind of insane and problematic and cause some issues. So eventually the US and the Russians left the Middle East. The Russians were kicked out, and then the US left, and that kind of left like a power vacuum, which led to a massive civil war. And there was this little tiny group called the Taliban that eventually rose to power, and they're still an issue. And then they painted the US as a godless enemy, and then that's kind of where the breeding of the hatred for the United States kind of happened. Now there's a lot more nuances and so many other factors that go into it, but that's kind of like a really brief breakdown of the progression from the Middle East as it was to the Middle East as it is now. And I'm not saying everyone in the Middle East hates America or is a terrorist or anything like that. I'm just saying that there is a long, really sad history of the Middle East, of people kind of basically using it for their own gain, and it's really sad. And then at the World Trade Center in 1993, there was an attack with a bomb in a van underneath the World Trade Center, and that obviously failed. And then 2001 happened by terrorist groups that hated America. I'm not implying anything. I just wanted to say that out loud too, because everything I'm saying isn't real and isn't Minecraft, and I just pulling it completely out of my ass. Just saying. So let's talk about PNAC. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that anymore, and I don't really care. Is the Project for the New American Century. This is a quote description from the Wikipedia again. This is going to be a big quote, so hold on. The PNAC was a massive neoconservative think tank created in 1997 and closed in 2006. Its goal was to promote American global leadership, because American global leadership is both good for America and good for the whole world. Now that's a quote from the Wikipedia page quoting what their beliefs kind of are, or were, I guess I should say. This think tank never really did anything, kind of, and it just had a massive influence on the development of the military, foreign policies, foreign relations, national security, the Iraq War, and within the previous administration of George Bush. Do with that as you will, young Jedi. So basically, this if it wasn't obvious, this group has massive ties to a bunch of different conspiracy theories, because of everything I just said, and because that a lot of members that were part of this think tank would later on become the major players in the administration under George Bush during the time of 9/11. So PNAC then would go on to release a report titled Rebuilding America's Defenses. And this was and is a paper report thing that you can find online that detailed what they believed and what they stood for. And what they believed in was that in order to secure the future of the United States, we needed to secure the oil market in the Middle East. And how they wanted to increase security in the U.S.'s military power in the States and also throughout the world, and specifically in the Middle East because the oil. However, the invasion of another country like the Middle East would be very hard to justify, especially to the United States people. So this is a quote from that document. Further, the process of transformation of the military, even if it brings revolutionary change, it is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. So basically what that's saying is that they want to expand the military and the U.S.'s security both in the States and in the world and justify a invasion of the Middle East. And in doing so would take a very long time, and it would be very hard to justify to the American people without some kind of quote-unquote new Pearl Harbor or some traumatic, horrible event. Now, I'm pretty sure at this point you could see where I'm kind of going with this. And this is why people believe that it was kind of a false flag. And for those who don't know, a false flag is kind of like when you say you've been attacked by someone or someone did something when they really haven't, but you've made it look like they did, so you can justify attacking them or doing something else. So a lot of people think that, the U.S. military or some powers that be staged 9/11 to happen so they could justify expanding the security both in the States and across the world and have a military invasion and presence in the Middle East to get the oil. Now, there is reason to believe that the government would do some kind of false flag type thing because it's happened before in Operation Northwoods, and basically this is when they were going to blow up a naval ship outside of Cuba and blame it on the Russians so that they can invade Cuba during the Cold War, but it never happened, thankfully, but it was considered highly, and then it was, no pun intended, shot down. So it's considered to be a possibility that the government has done or have considered false flags in the past. So it's not super far-fetched to assume or to think that 9/11 could have been a false flag as well. Another thing that I've heard whispers of that I haven't really looked into is that the war in Iraq, the battle plans and everything were drawn up beforehand. I don't know if I believe that, before the attacks. I don't know if I believe that. I haven't really looked into it, but that could also be some kind of, big giant piece of evidence that should be probably taken pretty seriously. So another piece of information is that Edward Snowden, the guy who exposed the government for spying on a bunch of people who now fled to Russia or whatever, says that the CIA knew about the 9/11 attacks before it was going to happen and told people who worked in high-level buildings such as the Pentagon and stuff like that to go home. And there are stories that a lot of the people who worked in the Pentagon left and didn't come back on 9/11 and weren't at work, and were told to leave or to take the day off. And I don't know what to think of that. And then also there's all the talk of the dude who owned it, who always had breakfast in the penthouse office every day just decided that on 9/11 he wasn't going to, and that he also then, like a few months earlier, decided to get insurance against terrorist attacks. He got insurance against terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, and then 9/11 happens. And then, apparently we've lost billions of dollars, and right before 9/11 happened, and these are all just like whispers of things that I could spend forever talking about. But it is kind of a fishy scenario, and I'm not saying anything. Do I believe in like the conspiracy theories? I think the whole they were drones or aliens or whatever have you, like the crazy stuff, I don't believe in it. I don't necessarily think that the government was in on it, but I don't think they were against it either. I don't know if I should say that. Everything I'm saying is not real. I don't believe that at all. I do think, though, that it was more of an opportunity that the government saw and kind of curated because of all of their influence in the Middle East. But again, I feel like there is still some murky waters there, so I'm not going to 110% say that I'm set in that belief or anything. I think there's a lot to be said about how the U.S. has influenced its image in the Middle East, and maybe that, the terrorists did, just naturally come up with the plan to, crash planes into the Twin Towers, and then the government was like, well, we needed something to validate invading the Middle East. So that's kind of like my 2 cents. I think the rabbit hole is probably deeper than what I was able to fit into this video. With that being said, if you guys want like a part 2 to go into more theories, I'm down. Just leave your suggestions and stuff in the comments. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And I appreciate you guys watching, and I hope that you guys enjoyed and had a good time. And if you like what you see here and you have any suggestions, like I said, leave them in the comments, and I hope you stick around and check out some of my other videos, and I will catch you in the next one.